The bustling terminal of John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York hummed with the low, continuous sound of thousands of travelers. Chloe Vance stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her husband Raymond Putnam, walking across the polished marble floor, with his hand resting on Irene Nelson's back. Raymond wore the charcoal gray wool suit Chloe had chosen for him months ago. Irene walked elegantly beside him in a soft cream-colored coat, smiling with practiced ease. Raymond's sharp eyes met Chloe's steady gaze. A slow, satisfied smirk spread across his face. He inclined his head toward Irene and addressed Chloe in a low, resonant tone, loud enough for nearby staff and passengers. He wondered if she had come all this way just to say a pathetic goodbye, or if she had finally accepted that certain luxurious journeys and lifestyles were never meant for a woman of her plain tastes. Irene gripped his arm with theatrical sweetness, looking down at Chloe's understated beige dress, and pleaded with her not to create a public scene in the prestigious terminal. Chloe took a single, slow breath and replied in a terrifyingly calm voice that she never created scenes because she preferred to observe how people exposed their own shallow natures when they believed they were untouchable. Raymond let out a short, mocking laugh, telling her to observe all she wanted, while first-class passengers boarded ahead, blind to the trap he had walked into. The true emotional blow was not Irene's presence. Chloe had smelled the betrayal for weeks in deleted text messages, late business meetings, expensive perfumes on Raymond's shirts, and icy silences at dinner. What truly pierced her was Raymond's calculated choice of this airport as the stage for his manufactured illusion of grand success. Here, private drivers waited with silver placards. Elite attendants guided them to private rooms with espresso in porcelain cups, and multi-million-dollar contracts were finalized. Raymond wanted Chloe to watch him cross that threshold with another woman, understanding she had been replaced not just in their bed, but in high society's hierarchy. Irene asked loudly if their private luxury transport would be waiting when their flight touched down in Washington. Raymond replied there would be 2 corporate vehicles, one for them, another for staff, and his private corporate jet, fueled and on standby if needed. Chloe's fingers tightened around her handbag strap. The words sounded obscene because of the colossal lie holding the display together. A premium airline representative stepped forward, informing them priority boarding would commence soon, and the elite lounge was prepared. Raymond accepted with a gracious nod. Irene cast a venomous glance at Chloe and suggested she find a common coffee shop to wait, as it would be more comfortable than watching everything she had lost. Raymond took half a step closer, whispering that Chloe had never appreciated this world of luxury and had judged it excessive. Now she no longer had to suffer the pretense of belonging to an elite class beyond her reach. In that second, something violently ruptured within Chloe, not her heart, already cracked weeks ago when Raymond treated her like expensive but useless furniture, but the last shred of pity she had for him. She looked up, her gaze locking onto his with icy intensity that made his smirk falter, and asked if he was entirely certain he wanted to board the aircraft in this manner. Raymond laughed, adjusting his cufflinks, and replied that as long as Irene was by his side, he was perfectly content. Chloe slowly raised her smartphone, her face an unreadable mask, and stated that his relationship was not what she had been asking about. She unlocked her screen and dialed a private number saved under Arthur. The call was answered on the first ring by a sharp, alert voice asking how he could assist. Chloe gave a direct command: immediately verify and review every instrument of financial guarantee and corporate credit linked to Putnam Executive Mobility, including premium tickets, elite lounge access, luxury vehicles, and backup aircraft leasing agreements. She demanded he also pull up clauses regarding unauthorized personal use of corporate assets and public reputational exposure. Then issue an immediate preventive suspension on all non-essential luxury accounts, preserving essential daily operations and lower-level employees. Raymond's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, demanding to know what ridiculous game she was playing. Chloe ignored him, continuing the call and instructing Arthur to suspend only personal executive privileges for now. The premium attendant's professional posture shifted to acute corporate alertness upon hearing the specific financial terminology. She radioed for supervisor confirmation on the Putnam booking and elite lounge credentials. The supervisor, a tall man in a tailored suit, approached and politely informed Mr. Putnam and Miss Nelson that there had been a mandatory update regarding their reservation's authorization status. He requested they step out of the priority line for an immediate manual review at the premium counter. Raymond forced a dry laugh, declaring his name had been primary on the account for years, and any error was a glitch. The supervisor explained that while his name was on the account, the primary financial guarantee had been legally suspended only 3 minutes ago. Irene's smile faded as she repeated, "mobility package," demanding to know why they were discussing corporate structures for simple first-class tickets. Chloe stood silently, remembering the lonely nights Raymond had yelled at her for wanting to understand the banking contracts, the countless evenings she signed personal extensions of her family's trust guarantees to prevent his company from losing credit rating while he slept upstairs, oblivious that his reputation was saved by the woman he deemed decorative. The supervisor continued, "The elite lounge access, VIP ground transportation, and standby corporate jet reservation all depended on that frozen authorization." The word jet crushed Raymond's bravado. For one fleeting second, Chloe saw the real man behind the facade, a terrified boy, petrified of being discovered as a fraud. The glimpse almost stirred compassion, but his earlier cruel laughter washed it away. Raymond spun to face her, whispering harshly that she wouldn't dare destroy his life's work over marital jealousy. Chloe sustained his gaze without flinching and informed him she had already done it, not destroying the company out of jealousy, but preventing him from using her family's ancestral wealth to finance his betrayals and fund luxury for his mistress. She unzipped her handbag, retrieved a thin leather folder, and opened it to display the prominent official seal. She told him the board had accepted her terms 3 years ago when they desperately needed her family's private fund to prevent bankruptcy. He had never bothered to read those clauses because he preferred to believe wealth materialized whenever he banged his fist on the boardroom table. Irene, shaking, whispered for him to resolve it. Chloe mockingly agreed he should fix his own problems, without using her family's name. The supervisor guided them away from the gate. The man who had announced his first-class status as social death to his wife minutes ago was now led away like a common trespasser past wealthy travelers pretending to ignore his downfall. Irene's stiletto caught on the divider, her face contorted with ugly rage. As she passed Chloe, she hissed that this was far from over, and Chloe would pay dearly. Chloe replied that for Irene, the nightmare was likely just beginning. Raymond stopped half a meter away, close enough for Chloe to smell the woody cologne she had gifted him. He asked with desperate bitterness if her goal had been to watch him fall flat on his face. Chloe took time to respond, then stated she had never wanted to see him fall. She had spent 7 years working tirelessly to prevent that failure. Her only desire was for him to stop climbing the social ladder by stepping on her neck. Raymond opened his mouth, but for the first time was left without words. As they walked away toward the premium desk, Chloe remained by the glass wall overlooking the tarmac. She realized she was also leaving that morning, from a life of quiet submission. Her phone vibrated. Arthur confirmed the suspension was registered, preserving operational accounts for the technical team. Only personal luxury privileges of Mr. Putnam and Miss Nelson were frozen. The private jet lease was under legal review. Chloe asked if core operations were secure. Arthur confirmed they were, though red alerts would trigger across the board before noon. Chloe commanded him to let the alerts flash. She would be in the boardroom before lunch. Arthur remarked that her late father, Ethan Vance, would have done the same, but Chloe replied her father wouldn't have waited this long. Chloe walked out into the crisp afternoon air and stopped at a small coffee kiosk. She bought a hot black coffee with no sugar, needing something warm for her slightly shaking hands from adrenaline. As she waited for her driver, she heard Raymond's familiar voice calling her name from behind, stripped of its usual power. She took a slow sip before turning. Raymond approached alone, face pale, devoid of arrogance. He said the airline had suspended every one of his premium corporate accounts. Chloe replied, they had only frozen what should never have been used for his private, unfaithful amusement. Raymond passed a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability, and whispered he had intended a long, honest conversation after returning from the trip. Chloe let out a quiet, humorless laugh, asking if that conversation was supposed to happen after the first-class flight, luxury hotel, and returning home to treat her like a lunatic for questioning his fidelity. He remained silent. She said he never wanted a conversation. He wanted her to discover the betrayal silently, to feel quiet, dignified shame, so he could continue his double life in comfort. She asked why his mistress possessed full access to his private corporate itinerary before the director of operations had seen it. The specific question caught him off guard. He demanded to know what she was talking about. Chloe took a step to the side, ending the discussion. She told him to take a common taxi to Wall Street and bring his explanations to the boardroom. She would be waiting with the actual legal contracts. When Chloe approached the sleek black corporate sedan, driver David jumped out. He informed her Mr. Putnam had requested the vehicle, but Chloe instructed that today he would not drive Raymond. He would take her directly to corporate headquarters on Park Avenue. David nodded and pulled into traffic as the airport faded into the New York skyline. Sitting in the back seat, Chloe's phone chimed with the first notification from a Wall Street financial blog reporting rumors of sudden executive mobility adjustments at Putnam Holdings. She rested her head against the leather headrest, but kept her eyes open, watching Manhattan materialize. Every mile tore away the version of herself that had waited for romantic crumbs, pulling her closer to the woman who now held the survival of hundreds of families in her hands. She opened the leather folder on her lap, tracing her signature. Chloe Vance Putnam, primary financial guarantor. For 7 years, the Putnam surname attached to her father's legacy had felt like a promise of unity. Today it looked like an expensive, polished silver handcuff. Her phone vibrated with a frantic text from Raymond, pleading not to take drastic action until she listened to his side. Chloe stared until the letters lost meaning, then typed that she had already listened at the airport gate. Now it was his turn to listen to her. She locked the screen and focused on the traffic as they crossed into Manhattan. The marriage was not legally over, accounts in chaos, Irene not finished, but Raymond Putnam's unchecked first-class arrogance had ended on JFK's tarmac. When the black sedan finally pulled up to Putnam Holdings' towering glass and steel skyscraper on Park Avenue, Chloe chose not to enter through the private underground garage. She instructed David to drop her at the grand main entrance beneath the massive silver logo, fully prepared to face whatever storm waited inside. Chloe stepped out and walked through the towering glass doors, ignoring the wide, startled eyes of receptionists, assistants, and junior executives who had read the explosive rumors. The architecture, soaring marble pillars, massive vertical garden, high-speed mirrored elevators, was designed to intimidate. Chloe walked across the expansive space without hesitation, holding the leather folder against her ribs, her posture commanding respect. At the main executive desk, the head receptionist stood, nervously informing her Mr. Putnam had not yet arrived. Chloe rested her hand on the polished counter and commanded in a register of absolute authority that the extraordinary board meeting be pulled forward from 11:30 to exactly 11 o'clock. The receptionist asked, upon whose authority? Chloe stated, it was issued by the primary financial guarantor of the credit facility, keeping the skyscraper functioning. The receptionist murmured confirmation and began sending updated notifications. In the private executive elevator, Chloe stared at her sharp reflection in the mirrored walls, barely recognizing the woman with cold, calculated determination. This was no longer the quiet wife in shock at the airport or the fragile daughter mourning Ethan Vance. She had transformed into the true custodian of her family's formidable legacy. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Raymond's executive assistant Melissa stood nervously with a digital tablet, face divided between loyalty and panic. She informed Chloe that Raymond had called from the road, demanding no one enter his private corner office before he arrived. Chloe didn't pause, walking past toward the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hallway, remarking coldly that the office did not belong to Raymond. It belonged to the corporation. Melissa followed frantically, whispering the CEO would be furious. Chloe stopped outside the double doors, turned with a sudden soft look of understanding, and murmured that she was well aware of how Fury felt. The only difference was, she had actually read the corporate bylaws before taking action. Melissa stepped aside. Chloe pushed open the doors and stepped into the massive office, with its aggressive panoramic view of the New York skyline. On Raymond's glass desk were signs of chaotic departure. 2 porcelain espresso cups, one with a rose-colored lipstick smudge, and an expensive leather folder from a Washington luxury hotel. Beside it lay a handwritten sticky note in Irene's sharp handwriting, instructing Raymond not to cede a single inch of ground to Chloe before the strategy meeting concluded. Chloe read it without touching the paper, a cold armor settling over her soul as she realized his mistress had viewed her as nothing more than a minor corporate obstacle. Arthur arrived 5 minutes later with distinguished silver-haired attorney Harper Davis, the most formidable expert in corporate governance, who had never treated Chloe like a wealthy man's accessory. Harper placed her heavy briefcase on the conference table and asked without hesitation if Chloe was fully prepared to open this legal Pandora's box today. Chloe pointed to the Washington hotel folder on the desk, stating quietly that the upcoming trip had been designed for something far more sinister than a romantic getaway. Arthur nodded grimly, pulling up encrypted documents on his laptop. He explained that Adams Ridge Group, a powerful Midwestern logistics conglomerate, had been quietly attempting to acquire a massive equity stake in one of Putnam's primary subsidiaries at a price significantly below market value. The proposal only made financial sense if the extensive package of executive mobility, luxury lodging, and political entertainment was absorbed as standard corporate expense by Putnam Holdings. Chloe felt a freezing chill as the pieces snapped together. Her husband hadn't just been traveling to cheat, he was actively weaponizing company resources to betray the legacy her father had built. Harper confirmed Raymond was bringing Irene into a highly sensitive corporate negotiation, with power to displace massive assets without full board approval. 15 minutes later, Raymond burst through the mahogany doors like a violent thunderstorm, slamming them shut. Melissa appeared briefly in the hallway, face pale with terror. Raymond stopped dead when he saw Chloe seated calmly at the head of the long marble conference table, with Arthur and Harper flanking her like a shield. The sight of his wife in the seat of power ignited fresh, blinding fury. He marched forward, violently throwing his smartphone onto the polished surface, demanding to know if she had completely lost her sanity. His phone had been ringing non-stop, with panicked calls from institutional investors demanding explanations for the sudden credit freeze. Chloe slowly closed the leather folder before her, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet whisper. The market was simply reacting to the objective truth that Putnam Holdings was entirely dependent on external family guarantees to fund the private, luxurious lifestyles of its executive leadership. Raymond pointed a trembling finger at Arthur, roaring that he was obeying the emotional commands of a scorned wife against the company's best interests. Arthur responded with calm professionalism that he answered not to emotional commands, but to the explicit legal framework of the contract signed by Chloe Vance and ratified by the full board. Raymond let out a harsh laugh, declaring the board belonged to him. Harper Davis intervened sharply, warning that his grand illusions of absolute control were exactly what would destroy his career before sunset. The temperature plummeted further when the doors opened again, and Irene Nelson stepped in without being called, wearing her flawless cream coat and a manufactured expression of wounded dignity. She asserted that since her personal reputation was being dragged through the mud, she possessed every legal right to be present. Chloe looked at Raymond, who instantly averted his eyes in pathetic shame, and asked with absolute quietness if he was the one who had invited his mistress into a high-level governance meeting. Raymond clenched his jaw and muttered that Irene was present because she served as primary consultant for corporate communication strategy and public relations image. Harper let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, cutting through the lie. A PR consultant possessed zero legal standing to participate in an extraordinary review of primary financial guarantees and trust fund allocations. Irene allowed a soft, manipulative smile and stepped closer, addressing Chloe with artificial sweetness. She suggested everyone knew this crisis had nothing to do with corporate governance. It was a classic case of a bitter, unloved wife using her inheritance to punish her husband for finding happiness elsewhere. Chloe had financed their private jets and luxury vehicles, but had never been capable of purchasing Raymond's respect. Chloe absorbed the attack without moving a muscle, replying quietly that she had never attempted to purchase love from Raymond. She had spent 7 years paying off his massive corporate debts. There was a vast difference between the two. Irene snapped that those debts belonged to the corporation, not Raymond personally. Chloe opened her leather folder, sliding a thick document across the table until it rested under Irene's manicured hands. This was the very first extension of personal financial guarantee she had signed, when the company lost its credit line with its 3 largest global suppliers. Raymond had begged her on his knees in their kitchen, promising it was temporary, and she had signed because she foolishly believed they were building a real family legacy. She slid a second document, the massive bailout after Raymond made a catastrophic, unapproved investment in a failing logistics network to impress his country club friends. She slid a third, the agreement allowing executive leadership to use luxury benefits as a public marketing tool to trick new investors into believing the firm was highly profitable when its actual cash reserves were empty. Raymond turned his face to the window, unable to look at the cold data of his continuous failures. Irene stood frozen, mouth open, but no words forming. At 11 o'clock, the heavy doors of the grand boardroom down the hall opened, and prominent board members began to arrive with ruthless punctuality. There were older men who had built the company with Raymond's father, 2 powerful independent female executives, and smooth-talking distant cousin Charles Putnam, who always smiled too much and said too little. Chloe entered last, choosing to sit near the far end of the long mahogany table to quietly observe who rushed to sit near Raymond before reviewing documents. Chairman Michael Sanders cleared his throat, demanding the private matter be handled with absolute social discretion, as markets were reacting nervously. Raymond immediately leaned forward, claiming Chloe was undergoing an emotional breakdown due to personal marital issues, and had taken reckless, unauthorized action at the airport, threatening the firm's stability. Irene, positioned behind his chair, chimed in that the PR crisis could be managed with a press release claiming a minor technical glitch in the booking system. Chloe looked past them to the chairman and stated firmly that before any public statements, she wanted it recorded that her suspension had targeted only unauthorized private luxury benefits, while travel arrangements for lower-level technical teams had been fully preserved. Independent Director Victoria leaned over with a sharp gaze, asking Arthur if Chloe's statement was factually accurate. Arthur opened his laptop, projecting verified banking receipts onto the digital screens, and confirmed every essential employee account remained fully active and funded. From that second, Raymond lost his fragile grip on the room, not because Chloe had screamed, but because she had refused to grant him the emotional spectacle he had prepared to fight. He had expected an unstable, weeping wife whose erratic behavior could be dismissed as a standard marital dispute. Instead, he faced a brilliant, cold strategist, armed with meticulously organized financial spreadsheets, precise contract dates, and a voice without a single tremble. Chloe walked the board through the complex structure of the primary financial guarantees in simple, devastatingly clear terms. Her family's trust fund had assumed immense financial risk, solely to protect Putnam Holdings from a devastating credit downgrade. The legally binding agreement stated these funds were to be used exclusively for legitimate corporate operations, preservation of the brand's public image, and necessary executive travel. weaponizing these accounts to finance long-term luxury travel for an individual with zero formal, board-approved employment, instantly triggered the mandatory compliance review clause. Raymond aggressively interrupted, shouting that Irene did hold a vital position. Independent Director Page immediately cut him off, demanding the exact date her contract had been approved by the Compensation Committee. Raymond hesitated 3 agonizing seconds before muttering the paperwork was in the final stages of formalization. Harper Davis slid a certified document across the table, coldly noting that in New York corporate law, in the final stages, was a sophisticated synonym for absolute lack of authorization. The tension reached a suffocating peak when Irene, realizing she was about to be erased, launched a desperate offensive. She stepped out from behind Raymond's chair, voice rising dramatically as she claimed the board was being manipulated by a powerful, wealthy woman, using her inheritance to destroy her husband's life out of vindictiveness. Raymond had been profoundly unhappy for years because Chloe treated their marriage like a cold extension of a corporate contract rather than a real home full of affection. A few older board members shifted uncomfortably, disgusted by the inappropriate exposure of private marital laundry in a professional boardroom, but Raymond remained completely silent. That pathetic silence pierced Chloe deeper than Irene's insults. It marked the second time in less than 24 hours that her husband had stood by and permitted another woman to publicly diminish her dignity before strangers. Chloe placed her hands flat on the polished wood, the silver light catching the empty space on her finger where her wedding ring had rested for 7 years. She looked directly at Irene and stated in a chillingly quiet voice that if Irene wished to discuss human affection, they should examine the actual data, noting that real affection was choosing not to let Raymond's company collapse into bankruptcy years ago when he still believed his success was a solitary achievement. Affection was keeping his secrets hidden from the market for years to preserve his fragile ego. She concluded by asking if affection was the audio recording she possessed, where Irene explicitly stated they needed to strip Chloe of her trust fund control so she could finally step out of the shadows. The boardroom became intensely silent. The faint hum of air conditioning felt like a roar. Raymond slowly turned to look up at Irene, voice cracking, as he demanded to know what recording his wife was referring to. Chloe did not waste a second. She tapped her smartphone and played a brief, highly specific 10-second segment of the leaked file through the room's integrated audio system. Irene Nelson's clear voice echoed off the walls, uttering the devastating sentence about their secret plan to remove Chloe from the trust fund so she could officially claim her position of power. When the audio cut off, Irene's face was completely devoid of color, her mouth opening and closing before she desperately claimed the sentence had been taken out of context during extreme professional pressure. Chloe quietly locked her device, remarking that the context was perfectly clear. It proved Irene had been hunting for the center of corporate financial power long before she had ever been granted an official security badge. Chairman Michael Sanders turned a fierce, disappointed gaze onto Raymond, demanding to know if he had been foolish enough to share the highly confidential legal structure of the family guarantees with an unapproved third party. Raymond appeared shell-shocked, stammering that he had only ever discussed the company's financial layout in general conversational terms, and had never handed over private internal documents. Harper Davis immediately projected a new log onto the digital screens, revealing that just the previous evening there had been a malicious, unauthorized attempt to access a highly restricted financial directory using temporary digital credentials linked to the Executive Communications Office, created from Raymond's personal presidential account less than 48 hours ago. Page remarked that it appeared someone had weaponized that administrative access to actively hunt for the private guarantee contracts, while Raymond was packing for Washington. Irene completely lost her sophisticated varnish, her voice dropping into a harsh defensive screech that the lawyers could never definitively prove she was the one who initiated the digital search. Chloe expected profound satisfaction watching her enemy crumble, but instead felt only deep, exhausting sadness. The public downfall of Irene Nelson could never erase the memory of the airport terminal, or return the years of her youth wasted confusing emotional endurance with true marital love. Watching Raymond slowly comprehend that the woman he had chosen over his wife had merely viewed him as a weak, easily manipulated stepping stone to a multi-million-dollar trust fund brought Chloe no comfort. It merely highlighted his profound carelessness, a dangerous trait in a man responsible for hundreds of employees' livelihoods. Raymond passed a trembling hand over his face, voice dropping into a broken whisper as he asked Irene how she could have betrayed his trust so calculatingly. Irene turned on him with eyes hard as flint, sneering that she had simply done what he never possessed the courage to do herself. She had attempted to drag him out from the suffocating shadow of his wife's family fortune. Chloe watched the exchange, realizing Irene had never truly been motivated by luxury clothing or jewelry. She was driven by a desperate psychological need to transform a fundamentally insecure man into her own personal social trophy. She wanted to rewrite Raymond's absolute financial dependence on the Vance family as a grand romantic tragedy, casting Chloe as the cruel jailer and herself as the beautiful liberator. Chloe looked across the table and remarked quietly that Irene had never wanted to pull him out of her family's shadow. She had simply wanted to step into that shadow herself and call it the sun. The meeting entered its most volatile phase when Chairman Michael Sanders officially proposed a mandatory, temporary suspension of Raymond Putnam from his position as Chief Executive Officer until the independent audit was fully completed. It was in this exact moment that Charles Putnam saw his long-awaited opportunity. He leaned forward like a vulture, suggesting with calculated concern that the current crisis demonstrated a massive structural flaw within the company, far deeper than Raymond's personal indiscretions. The corporation had become a dangerous hostage to a volatile dynamic between Raymond's reckless behavior and the immense, unconstitutional financial influence of the Vance Trust Fund. The board needed to immediately consider massive corporate restructuring that would permanently eliminate their absolute dependence on Chloe's family money. Chloe locked her eyes onto her husband's cousin, instantly recognizing the true predator. Charles didn't care about moral standing or public reputation. He was using the marital scandal to launch a hostile internal takeover. Independent Director Victoria spoke up sharply, pointing out that massive restructuring could never be safely improvised in the middle of a high-profile compliance investigation. Charles allowed a condescending smirk, replying that the board could not permit an external financial guarantor to single-handedly dictate which executives could travel, which contracts could be signed, and how the company conducted daily business. Chloe did not allow his provocation to shake her. She slowly opened her secondary leather folder and slid a fresh set of documents directly to the chairman. She stated calmly that Charles spoke eloquently about independence, but her personal legal team had discovered fascinating data just the previous evening. The Adams Ridge Group, the very conglomerate Charles was aggressively pushing as a new financial partner to replace the Vance Trust, maintained a highly secretive, indirect profit-sharing structure with a private consulting firm registered under Charles's own brother-in-law's name. The smug smile died on Charles's face. He stammered that her accusation was a defamatory lie lacking substance. Harper Davis took control of the digital screens, displaying clear corporate organograms, revealing a hidden network of shell companies, recent suspicious bank wires, and off-market agreements connecting Charles directly to the undervalued acquisition proposal Raymond had been carrying to Washington. The brilliant, multi-layered strategy was laid bare. Irene had been weaponized to manipulate Raymond's fragile ego, while Charles prepared to swoop in as corporate savior, using the manufactured crisis to force the sale of a highly valuable subsidiary to his secret partners for pennies on the dollar. Raymond had been vain, unfaithful, and irresponsible, but he had also been a useful idiot for far more dangerous players within his own family circle. Chloe looked across the table at her husband's cousin, stating firmly that she was absolutely not protecting Raymond from the consequences of his actions, but she was fully prepared to protect her father's corporate legacy from a pack of wolves who had mistaken a family crisis for a weak opportunity. Michael Sanders slammed his fist on the table, demanding absolute silence as 3 board members began shouting. Raymond, face entirely devoid of life, slowly rose from his chair. He looked around at the directors who had smiled at his lavish parties for years and finally admitted his absolute guilt. He confessed he had signed the broad administrative authorization for Irene without ever reading the compliance details because he was desperately driven by a pathetic need to prove to the world that he was a self-made billionaire who did not require the financial backing of the Vance family. In his desperate attempt to flee from his wife's shadow, he had willingly opened the front door of the corporation to a hostile takeover that would have destroyed the livelihoods of every single employee. Raymond turned to the board, voice steadying, and officially announced his immediate, voluntary resignation from Chief Executive Officer, requesting the board suspend all negotiations with Adams Ridge Group until a thorough forensic investigation was conducted. He did not look at Chloe, choosing instead to face the consequences before the entire room. Marking the first time in his adult life, he had chosen accountability over an elegant lie. Charles Putnam attempted to storm out, shouting about illegal accusations and threatening legal retaliation. But Harper Davis politely reminded him that 2 federal compliance officers were already waiting in the main lobby downstairs. One by one, the board members cast their official votes, overwhelmingly approving the immediate suspension of Raymond Putnam, the total termination of Irene Nelson's consulting privileges, and a comprehensive forensic audit into Charles's financial dealings. When the final gavel struck, Chloe felt absolutely zero sense of personal triumph or vindictive joy, only an immense, exhausting wave of relief as the heavy corporate theater finally drew to a close. The official public statement released by Putnam Holdings later that afternoon was a masterpiece of Wall Street discretion, completely omitting any mention of the airport confrontation, the mistress, or the marital infidelity. It simply informed the market that the corporation, in absolute alignment with its primary financial guarantor, the Vance Trust, was enacting a temporary restructuring of its executive leadership to ensure absolute compliance and corporate transparency. Irene Nelson vanished from Manhattan's elite social circles with terrifying speed, discovering high society possessed an incredibly short memory for characters who no longer held invitations to primary boardrooms. She attempted to leak her own version to gossip columns, casting herself as a brilliant woman systematically crushed by an old money dynasty. But without Raymond's corporate black card to fund her lifestyle, public interest faded within a week. She had spent months hunting for a shortcut to the peak of New York society, only to discover shortcuts built on deceit always terminate in a solid concrete wall. As the sun began to set over the city, casting long amber shadows across the polished wooden floors of her father's old apartment in Gramercy Park, Chloe sat quietly by the small fireplace, holding a warm cup of tea. She had refused to return to the massive Park Avenue penthouse, choosing the quiet comfort of the modest home where Ethan Vance had lived before success transformed their lives. The door buzzer sounded. David's voice informed her Raymond was standing in the lobby downstairs, completely alone, requesting just 5 minutes to deliver a final document. Chloe closed her eyes, a heavy sigh escaping, then instructed the doorman to let him up, knowing some conversations cannot be left bleeding beneath the door if one truly wishes to heal. When Raymond stepped into the warm apartment, he looked like a completely different man. He had discarded his expensive Italian suit jacket, his silk tie was missing, and he carried a simple manila envelope instead of his usual luxury briefcase. He walked to the old wooden dining table, carefully placed the envelope, and informed her he had officially signed over his personal power of attorney to the Independent Audit Committee, ensuring unrestricted access to every corporate email he had ever sent. He looked down at her hands, eyes lingering on the bare skin of her left ring finger, and murmured he wanted to offer his deepest, most sincere apologies for the immense disrespect he had shown her at the airport. Chloe looked up, face bathed in firelight, and replied quietly that his apologies felt incredibly small because the damage inflicted on their shared history was far too massive for a single word to carry. Raymond nodded in silent agreement, admitting he didn't expect forgiveness or a second chance. He simply needed to look her in the eye and admit he had thrown away the only authentic relationship he had ever possessed because he wanted to feel like a king. He had spent their entire marriage terrified of being judged as an extension of her father's greatness, never realizing his own blinding vanity was the very thing that made him small. Chloe rose from her chair, walked to the table, and reached into her pocket, retrieving a small, polished wooden box that had once belonged to Ethan Vance. She placed it on the table between them, opening the lid to reveal her platinum wedding ring resting quietly on dark velvet, its brilliant diamond catching the dim light. She looked at her husband, voice dropping into a gentle but unyielding tone, and told him she had spent 7 years attempting to love him without ever controlling his actions, while he had spent those same years using her resources while resenting her very existence. Their marriage had not ended because he found another woman at an airport gate. It had ended because he had continuously chosen to view her loyalty as a financial prison rather than a safe harbor. Raymond stared down at the ring, a single silent tear escaping his eye and tracing a path down his lined face. The first time Chloe had ever seen him display genuine, unvarnished human emotion. He whispered that he was officially entering intensive psychological counseling, not to perform a noble trick for the board, but because he desperately needed to discover who he was when he wasn't hiding behind an expensive title and a manufactured illusion of power. The formal divorce proceedings were finalized 3 months later, with an absolute lack of public drama. Raymond kept his promise and refused to contest a single financial clause. The massive Park Avenue penthouse was put on the market, its white walls and designer furniture stripped, until it looked like nothing more than an empty, expensive stage where two people had spent a decade pretending to be happy. Raymond accepted a minor, non-voting advisory role within a philanthropic branch of the company, in a quiet Midwestern town, entirely stripped of executive privileges, private jet access, and grand expense accounts. For a man who had once defined his worth by the height of his office chair and priority boarding pass, the sudden demotion was a profound daily lesson in absolute humility. Chloe officially assumed her position as chief trustee of the Vance Fund, shifting her focus from managing Raymond's ego to investing in sustainable infrastructure and supporting young female entrepreneurs building businesses with integrity. 1 full year after that fateful morning at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Chloe found herself walking through the familiar glass corridors of the International Departures Terminal once more. But the world felt entirely different. She wore a simple slate-gray wool coat, carried her own small leather suitcase, and held a commercial business-class ticket purchased entirely with her own independent funds. She was preparing to board a flight to Miami, Florida, invited to deliver the keynote address at a prestigious national summit on ethical corporate governance and the protection of family legacies. As she walked past the entrance of the very elite lounge where Raymond had attempted to humiliate her 12 months prior, she paused briefly, looking at her reflection in the polished glass. The lines around her eyes were slightly deeper, her hair styled simpler and softer, but the look of quiet, unyielding serenity in her gaze was something no amount of old money inheritance could purchase. She realized with profound gratitude that the terrible betrayal she had endured had not broken her spirit. It had acted as a fierce, necessary fire that burned away the illusions, keeping her a prisoner in her own life. As she waited near her boarding gate, sipping hot tea, she suddenly noticed a familiar figure sitting quietly on a public bench a few yards away, dressed in a simple corduroy jacket and reading a worn book. It was Raymond, who had just arrived from his Midwestern office for a routine compliance meeting, traveling on a standard commercial flight without a single assistant or private driver. He looked up from his book, eyes meeting hers across the crowded terminal. Instead of the arrogant smirk or pale panic of the past, he simply offered a soft, respectful nod. He rose, walking over slowly while maintaining polite distance, and quietly wished her a safe and successful journey to her conference. Chloe looked at the man before her. He appeared slightly older. His face bore marks of a difficult year of self-reflection. But for the first time since she had known him, his eyes were completely clear, honest, and grounded in reality. She thanked him with a genuine, gentle smile. As the gate agent announced general boarding, she turned and walked down the jet bridge into her own bright, independent future. As we journey through the long corridors of a full human life, we often accumulate possessions, titles, and relationships we mistakenly believe define our worth, building elaborate fortunes of social validation that can vanish in a single morning. For those who have lived long enough to watch seasons change and hair turn silver, the true value of existence clarifies into a single unyielding truth. No amount of luxury, status, or public applause can ever compensate for the slow, quiet erosion of your personal dignity. True strength is never found in the loud, aggressive display of power over others, nor in the arrogant assumption that wealth places a person completely beyond the reach of moral consequences or human vulnerability. The most profound tragedies do not occur when a business empire falls or a trust fund diminishes. They happen when a human being willingly diminishes their own soul, staying silent in the face of continuous disrespect just to keep a beautiful illusion alive. We must learn to recognize that loyalty to a shared history should never be transformed into a lifetime financial contract that funds our own emotional destruction and strips us of self-respect. When a relationship, career, or social circle demands that you continuously minimize your own truth, hide your intelligence, and disappear into the background so another person's fragile ego can appear grand, the most courageous action is to walk away. It takes immense maturity to realize that walking away from a toxic dynamic is not an act of bitter vengeance or declaration of war. It is simply the ultimate, quiet boundary of a self-respecting soul. Life has a beautiful, cyclical way of stripping away the artificial scaffolds we build out of vanity, forcing every one of us to eventually stand naked before the mirror of our own choices and face the truth of who we are. To the younger generations still fiercely climbing social ladders of success, the elders would say, never allow your ambition to outrun your character, and never mistake the temporary privileges of high office for the permanent respect of your peers. True royalty is found in the quiet serenity of a clean conscience, in the knowledge that you have treated others with absolute honesty, and in the profound bravery of choosing to navigate the storms of life on your own terms. Ultimately, the most beautiful décolletage a person can ever experience is the moment they finally gather the courage to cancel the wrong flight, step out of the shadows of deceit, and proudly reclaim the absolute ownership of their own journey.